This is The Red Line, where we interview three geopolitical experts on one big issue shaping the news both here and overseas. And I'm your host, Michael Hilliard. I want to start this episode with a bit of a fun fact question. What do you think was the most expensive weapon system the United States built throughout the period of the 1940s, through the entire Second World War, and into the very early Cold War? Now, for those of you who took a second to really think about it, I'm guessing a few of you are probably thinking about the big carrier programs the US rolled out during the Second World War. Things like the Essex or the Midway class. And I'm sure even more of you, particularly those who've seen Oppenheimer, probably sat back and thought it'd be the Manhattan Project, the project to create the first nuclear bomb. But actually it wasn't that either. In fact, the most expensive program the US rolled out over that period was the B-29 bomber program, which all up would end up costing roughly 40% more than the entirety of the Manhattan Project, with all of that cash being expended for an aircraft that would enter service in 1944 and be retired by 1960, spending just 16 years in service. However, it was a pretty impressive plane, and a pretty impressive 16 years as well. Compared to its main predecessor, the B-17, it was not only 20% faster, but also had a 60% longer range and could carry roughly triple the payload of a B-17. It was this plane here, the B-29, that enabled the US to carry out the devastating firebombings of Tokyo, some of the most massive raids across the Korean peninsula, and ultimately was the plane that allowed the US to deliver the first nuclear strikes in history. People already had an idea on just how influential strategic bombing could be, but after those nuclear strikes, everyone became aware of what a single one of these platforms could actually unleash. Strategic bombing became a way for states like the US to be able to inflict massive damage upon their opponents, whilst only actually risking the lives of handfuls of aircrews. And yet, only a handful of nations still actually operate these platforms at scale. And depending on which analyst you ask, you're probably either going to hear that they're relics of a time long gone, whilst on the other hand hearing people say that they are the very tip of the spear, and that it's because of platforms like these that the US was one of the only nations to be able to carry out something like the strikes we just saw on Iran's nuclear facilities. Strikes conducted by the US's strategic bomber fleet. But where does the truth lie? What are the roles of strategic bombers in 2025? Which countries still actually operate these things? And how will the next generation of these planes reshape the balance of power in Europe and the Pacific? Well, that's the big question we're going to be asking here today. And to help us unpack how these aircraft became so important and where they're likely heading next, we turn to our first guest.
Part 1: Stars and Strikes.
I'm not here in an official capacity, and the views, thoughts, and opinions I offer are my own and do not represent the official views or policies of the U.S. government or Air Force. The Strategic Bomber Force for the U.S. Air Force has always been a pivotal component of our force composition. One of our core functions is global strike, and our Strategic Bomber Force enables global strike for the U.S. Air Force. Certainly the roles of strategic bombers, as we look at some of the more geographically challenging regions that we have to operate, they allow us to reach out and to strike targets in those areas, whereas other capabilities may have difficulty doing that.
Colonel David Gordon is the chair of the Department of Leadership and Warfighting at the US Air Force's Air War College, as well as the former Global Strike Command chair, the former Inspector General of US Air Forces in Europe and Africa, and the former Deputy Chief of the Nuclear Operations Division of the US Joint Staff. In addition to all that, he also formerly commanded the 2nd Operations Group at Barksdale Air Force Base and was the Deputy Commander of the 5th Operations Group, commanding a lot of the strategic bombers that we're talking about here. So, let's do it down on the program today.
Obviously, we have a reduced overseas force presence from the time of the Cold War. So our ability to forward project forces from our overseas bases has been reduced significantly. And I think that requires us to rely more heavily on our strategic bomber fleet to be able to hit those targets from long distance. Additionally, I would say that the role of the strategic bomber in the nuclear triad has always been there and is not diminished today.
With strategic bombers are still formally one leg of the US's nuclear triad, the other two being the land-based ICBMs, the big missiles that come out of the ground and make cities disappear, and the submarine-launched ballistic missiles, these being the ones launched from submarines. with strategic bombers being the third way of delivering nuclear weapons. And that made perfect sense back in the early Cold War, when missiles were pretty unreliable and short-ranged, and bombers at that point were really the only long-range option to get nuclear weapons into the battlefield. But fast forward to today, and we're far more reliant on the other two legs of the triad than we are on strategic bombers, particularly in the age of satellite tracking, hypersonic missiles, and layered air defense networks. And the idea of a crew taking off from Europe and making it all the way to Moscow, using the same delivery method as Amazon next-day shipping, sounds a lot harder than it once did. So the question is, why keep using strategic bombers within that triad? What do these bombers provide that the other two legs don't?
Well, I think our strategic triad has a number of capabilities that are important across the gamut to provide reliable and assured options for the president in the event of the need for a nuclear strike. Our ICBM force is always available, they're always capable, and they're ready to respond at a moment's notice. Our SLBM force is always available, and they provide an assured second strike capability and options for the president as well. But our bomber force also provides that visible presence. If there's a need for us to deter an adversary or to provide an escalated force posture, then we can arm up the nuclear bombers and provide that signaling to a potential adversary. We can also potentially, if necessary, launch and recall those bombers if the president finds that the situation on the ground has changed. For example, Operation Midnight Hammer, which occurred recently against the Natanz nuclear sites in Iran, was conducted by a B-2 bomber. That bomber was launched from the United States and flew around the world to attack those targets with a massive ordnance penetrator conventional munition. But I think if we were to come up with a hypothetical scenario where Iran had attacked one of our allies or partners or even U.S. forces in the region with a nuclear weapon, and the president decided to respond with a nuclear option, that B-2 is just as capable of dropping a B-61 Mod 11, which is a nuclear weapon designed for the B-2. So it gives a lot more credible options to the president for attacking targets with the right amount of force and the right amount of precision. And of course, without launching ICBMs that could potentially cause an increase in concern and force posture from around the world.
So as of this recording, the US fields 3 different types of strategic bombers, each of which has its own job within the Air Force. But the oldest and probably the most iconic of these is the B-52 Stratofortress, a massive bomber aircraft that has a range of roughly 1,400 kilometers, which for context is roughly the same distance as Washington to Hanoi. But as I said, it is quite an old aircraft. In fact, it's a 1950s design that entered service with the US Air Force in 1961. And although the airframes have been somewhat re-engineered and rewired, and these things are now equipped with long-range cruise missiles, why do we still keep such an old aircraft in service?
You know, I'd actually flown the B-52 for about 22 years of my career, and this is a question that I'd asked myself many times over the years is, why do we keep a B-52 that's been flying now for almost 70 years in the arsenal when the history of aviation itself is 120 years old? And the truth is, we have a number of platforms within the U.S. Air Force that we've kept in service for a very long time. The B-52, the KC-135, the C-130, the U-2. These are all examples of aircraft that we've kept around for a very long time. When the B-52 was originally designed, it was designed to deliver a nuclear payload at high altitude against targets around the world. And we quickly discovered in 1960, when Francis Gary Powers was shot down, that the ability to deliver high altitude payloads like that was no longer assured. And so we adapted in the 60s with the B-52G and the H model to be able to deliver those nuclear payloads at low altitude using terrain avoidance systems and low-level cameras. And then once the low-altitude radar regime became much more capable, we switched to launching air-launched cruise missiles. And the B-52 has been used not only in that nuclear triad role for many years, but also in a number of conventional conflicts, from loading up the Big Belly Mod during Vietnam to do conventional strategic bombing, to Operation Senior Surprise, which was also called Secret Squirrel, the opening salvo of Operation Desert Storm, as well as multiple cruise missile launches during Operations Desert Strike, Desert Fox, against Slobodan Milosevic during Operation Allied Force, and of course the opening salvo in Operation Iraqi Freedom, as well as being used for close air support during Operation Enduring Freedom in Afghanistan. I think when Curtis LeMay submitted the original design, we never imagined a situation where we would be using strategic bombers with laser-guided targeting pods and GPS-guided weapons to support ground forces in Afghanistan. Yet the B-52 has just been so completely adaptable. And I think it's that adaptability that keeps the B-52 relevant today.
So if we move to our next strategic bomber, we arrive at the B-1, or more specifically, the B-1B Lancer, with this bomber coming from the second generation of strategic bombers, a category that at present only the US and Russia currently occupy. Now, these second generation bombers come with what's called a variable geometry wing. In other words, the wings of the plane can swing forward or swing back depending on what the pilot needs, allowing the pilot to travel either very fast or very slow, depending on what they need for the mission. Now, the B-1 entered service with the United States Air Force in 1986, and whilst originally thought to be a nuclear delivery system, today are pretty much strictly conventional only, with the US keeping about 43 of these planes in service. So if the B-1 is still only used to deliver conventional weapons, what is the B-1's role as compared to either of the other two strategic bombers?
The B-1 itself has been remarkably capable over the years, and it's been a workhorse during the global war on terror. So it's provided a lot of additional capacity to the U.S. bomber fleet in the past couple decades. In fact, it has, in some configurations, a larger payload capacity than the B-52. So I would say that the two are remarkably similar in their capabilities. And I think that's part of the reason that we potentially are looking at divesting the B-1 from the inventory going forward.
So whilst I agree there's a lot of overlap between the role of the B-52 and the B-1 is a far more modern plane than the B-52. So why is it then that it seems to be the B-1 that the US Air Force is currently trying to phase out?
Yeah, the B-1, I think, has been a difficult aircraft from a serviceability and maintainability perspective. And it is a more costly aircraft to employ on a flying hour basis than the B-52. So I think cost is probably one of the major drivers as to why we would eventually divest the B-1 from the inventory. I mean, the B-1s have been stationed at Ellsworth Air Force Base for decades now. And I don't think it's any coincidence that Ellsworth Air Force Base has been chosen as the debut location for the B-21 squadron. So I think that we'll be looking at potentially removing the B-1 from service and using instead the B-52 as well as the capabilities of the B-2 and B-21 in the near term.
Now, before we get into the B-2, I want to talk a bit about trade-offs, because this is where we hit our first big trade-off. Because when you're designing a strategic bomber, every advantage you add comes at the cost of something else. For example, the B-1 Lancer, whilst being far more modern and could easily outrun the B-52 at Mach 1.2, that level of speed comes at a pretty staggering price, with each B-1 costing roughly 20 times as much to build as the B-52. And on top of that, it also costs about twice as much to operate per flight hour, costing roughly about $173,000 per flight hour as compared to about $88,000 per flight hour for the B-52. And that high maintenance cost also doesn't include the massive headache in trying to find spare parts for B-1s that have been out of production for decades now, which is why these days the B-1 tends to spend a lot more time in the hangar than it does in the air, and one of the reasons the US has moved to the B-2, or the B-2 Spirit as it's known. This one being the black triangular strategic bomber that most people think about when they think about strategic bombers. Now, the B-2 entered service in 1997, and unlike the B-1 and the B-52, its entire reason for existing is pretty much its stealth capabilities. As whilst it traded off speed, it gained an incredibly low radar cross-section, making it almost impossible for an air defense operator to hit the thing unless they're looking directly at it. And whilst the B-2, much like the B-1, is also incredibly expensive to operate, that survivability is why the US tends to keep it in the inventory. And to give you an idea of just how expensive it is to run a B-2 these days, if we look at the recent Putin-Trump summit that happened in Alaska, where the US had a B-2 overfly Vladimir Putin for the sake of a photo op, just that journey from Whiteman Air Force Base up to Anchorage, loitering around Anchorage in preparation to overfly Putin, and then flying back to Whiteman Air Force Base, once you include the fuel and maintenance cost, probably cost the US Air Force somewhere around $2 million to do, which should give you an idea on how expensive some of these strategic bombers are. So with that in mind, can you take us through some of these trade-offs? How does the US decide between, let's say, affordability and survivability?
I think any aircraft that the U.S. military designs is essentially a hypothesis as to how that aircraft is going to be used in conflict and the type of adversary that it's going to be used against. And I think when you look at the characteristics of strategic bomber design, you have to come up with some sort of a hypothesis as to what you expect it to do. The B-2 is designed to get after those denied environments, those radar environments where we need to get somebody in there undetected and strike targets. And so I think as we look at the design of strategic bombers, we're always going to have that hypothesis in mind.
That makes some sense. Even if the B-52 is half the price to operate, none of that actually matters if it gets shot down halfway to its target. So let's talk about the B-2 for a bit. Outside of its stealth capabilities, what sets it apart from the B-1 and the B-52?
Well, the B-2 is an extraordinarily capable platform, and we've used it multiple times in multiple conflicts in the time since it's entered service in 1997. Obviously, the stealth characteristics are extraordinarily for the B-2. It allows access to and lack of detection from enemies and adversaries around the world. It also has a remarkably diverse payload capability with its rotary launchers and its two bomb bays. It can carry an incredible number of different types of weapons and provide different capabilities on the battlefield. Additionally, it has the ability to stay aloft and target in some of those denied environments a lot better than the B-1 does.
So whilst the B-2 is the only third-generation strategic bomber currently in service, and from most sources is still well ahead of most other players when it comes to stealth technology, how confident are you that, let's say, the B-2 could take off from the United States and safely drop a bomb on a defended target like Beijing or Moscow?
I think as we look at adversary capabilities around the world, I think we need to remember that the capabilities that are being fielded today are extremely advanced, and that I don't think any one platform on its own has the ability to overcome enemy air defenses. We're going to have to work as a team, and it's going to require a group effort. And I think the B-2 is just one of those tools that we would need to use in order to gain access to enemy territory. And, I think as we look at the challenges of gaining and maintaining air superiority around the world, we can see that there's a lot of different types of things that we're going to have to do in order to gain that. We look at potentially the way the war in Ukraine has come across, and we thought that initially the Russians would have the capability of quickly gaining access to the entirety of the airspace over Ukraine, and that turned out not to be the case. It's a much more difficult nut to crack. And in certain situations, we find just the opposite, where we thought maybe Tehran had a much more robust air defense system, and we found out that the Israelis were able to quickly overcome that air defense and achieve air superiority in the skies over Iran. So I don't think that there's any one specific tool that you can use to overcome those types of things.
So I've often heard this dynamic described as a bit of a cat and mouse game, where every time you improve the stealth of an aircraft, someone on the other side of the equation is designing a better radar or better longer range missile or a faster data link that could detect you. And that whilst the B-2 Spirit is probably one of the most survivable bombers ever built and can pretty confidently operate against an adversary like Serbia in the 90s or even a state like Iran today, when you start talking about somewhat more capable militaries like Beijing or Moscow, that picture's probably going to change a bit. So can you unpack this cat and mouse game a little bit more for us?
I think it's always been a bit of a cat and mouse game. I mean, we go back to the example of the B-52 flying high altitude over air defenses, and then the enemy air defenses finding ways to attack targets at high altitude, and then going low altitude, and then the enemy air defenses finding ways to detect and attack targets at low altitude. I think that stealth technology offered an incredible advantage when it came to lack of detection from radar. If you look at the B-2, it was released in 1997. This was back when folks were using 486 computers with Windows 95. And if you look at the technological leaps and bounds that we've had in the almost 30 years since the B-2 has been introduced, you can imagine that there are a lot more capabilities now available to the average nation than were back 30 years ago.
Which is probably one of the main reasons that Washington has just rolled out its next generation of strategic bomber, this being the B-21 Raider, an aircraft built by Northrop Grumman that was first unveiled in late 2022. So my question is, what does the B-21 offer the US Air Force that, let's say, the B-2 doesn't?
I can't speak to the specific capabilities of the B-21, but if you use the analogy of technology and the improvements that we've seen in the past 30 years, you can only imagine that a B-2 that incorporates those technological advances would be much more capable today than it would have been 30 years ago. The other aspect that I've been told is that the B-21 is an open systems architecture, which to me leads me to believe that the Air Force has thought about how we're going to adapt these capabilities over time against enemies with advanced capabilities as they continue to improve their detection systems and capabilities, that we should be able to incorporate new technologies and new capabilities into this aircraft as well.
Now, in what is honestly a massive shock to anyone who follows US defense procurement, the B-21 program actually seems to be running relatively smoothly. In fact, it actually seems to be running not only on time, but also to budget, which is a pretty big contrast to some of the other big ticket projects we've talked about before, like the nuclear missile modernization or all the problems around the Columbia-class submarine. In fact, there seems to be so much faith in the B-21 project that Northrop Grumman even put in a lot of its own money to fund the production line and build the prototype early. And in response, the US Air Force seems to be signaling they're now willing to buy about 100 of these aircraft, which would potentially make the B-21 the future backbone of America's bomber force. So my question is, why is this program running so smoothly when so many of the other US defense projects are frankly disasters at the moment?
Northrop Grumman, who was awarded the contract for the B-21, has been maintaining the B-2 for quite a long time, and they've learned a lot of lessons about maintainability and serviceability that I suspect are being applied to the B-21 program, making this a much more available and capable aircraft from a combat perspective. I've seen in open source news interviews that the program itself is on track, on schedule, and on budget, which I think is fantastic. And I think it speaks to the fact that when we designed the B-21, we had a solid understanding of what we were trying to do with it, and that we continue to focus on that path in building that aircraft for what it's designed to do.
Which again makes some sense as to why it's gone the way it has, particularly when you start to look at some of these other US programs, where for instance the US Navy has made over 4,000 changes to the design of the Gerald Ford class carrier after it's been put into production, creating a lot of double work or erasing previous work in order to accommodate the new stuff. Now, whilst the B-21 program has avoided that trap so far, the R&D money's been spent and the production line is being tooled up, if I were Northrop, I'd probably still be a little bit nervous, because this is a story we've heard before. Because whilst the Air Force has promised to purchase 100 of these aircraft, the Air Force hasn't always followed through with those kind of agreements. In fact, originally the Air Force promised to buy 132 B-2 Spirit bombers, only to then see Congress slash that order down to just 21 of the aircraft, which is a large part of the reason the B-2 carries such an eye-watering price tag today. As whilst the aircraft itself might only cost $900 million to build, once you add in the development costs, it comes in at roughly $2 billion a plane. Because rather than being able to spread those development costs across 132 planes, you're now spreading it over just 21. So my question is, what guarantees does Northrop Grumman have that Congress or the Pentagon or whoever won't simply just repeat history and scale back the production chain of the B-21?
Ultimately, the decision as to how many aircraft we field is made by our elected officials. Congress controls the budget. And so I think the influence against our elected officials as to how big the program should be is primarily based on two factors. You'd mentioned that the B-2 was originally designed for over 100 aircraft, but if we look at the two factors at the time that were made public about the reason to scale down the B-2 program, number one was the perceived threat. At the end of the Cold War, there was no longer that threat that we needed a lot of these extremely advanced technological capabilities. We thought peace was going to break out, and there was certainly a reduced threat perception among elected officials. And the other was the cost. It was a very expensive program at the time. And because of that expense and that lack of perceived threat, I believe they made the decision to cut that 100 aircraft production line into 20 to 21 aircraft eventually. Now, if you use those two factors for today's environment, I don't think that we see a reduced threat, reduced perception of threat. And if anything, I think we see an increased perception of threat and world disorder as threats to our national security. So I don't see a public perception that we don't need these capabilities in our arsenal. I think that that perceived threat is still there. And as we mentioned, the program itself is on cost, on budget, and on time. And if that doesn't change, then I can't imagine why they would go away from the existing plan.
So what then would be a response if a congressman were to say something like, look, we have all these F-35s sitting around, they can drop bombs, why are we spending so much money on the B-21 program? What's the use of strategic bombers when we have all these smaller aircraft already in service?
So an F-35 is an extraordinarily capable platform, and I think that it can definitely achieve targeting effects in any environment that it was in. But it has to be forward positioned. It has to be deployed to some place that can be reached by the pilots through air refueling. And of course, it has to be part of that package as well. And I can see in a situation where if you need to strike a target relatively quickly, And if you need to do it without the ability to forward deploy and forward position those assets, that the B-52 can launch from home station, fly halfway around the world, and strike those targets, as it has proven in multiple combat missions. For the United States, it's almost always been an away game for us. We've become very good at conducting long-distance, long-range operations because we've always had to. We've been fortunate that oceans separate us from our potential adversaries. The ultimate goal is always to be able to provide a platform that can access denied environments, that can acquire targets, and that can rapidly and precisely strike those targets. I think that's always the goal. I think the strategic bomber will always be focused on doing that. And that as we go forward in the future, we'll just see additional technological advances from electronics and stealth technology and engines and our ability to detect and identify these targets.
So where do you think that leaves the future for the US strategic bomber fleet? Because a lot of analysts have speculated that the US Air Force is currently moving towards a more simplified structure, one primarily built around the old, cheaper to operate, reliable B-52s on one side, and a large fleet of brand new B-21 Raiders on the other, with the B-1 definitely being retired, and the B-2 probably going into retirement after that. Do you think that's where we're actually heading at the moment? A future where the United States Strategic Bomber Force relies on just 2 or 3 major platforms?
I think that in the immediate future, that combination of the B-21 and the B-52 provides a lot of capability, a lot of options for the U.S. military, and a lot of options for the president to strike targets around the world. There are a number of high technology capabilities that we're looking to come online in the next few years, to include long-range standoff options and hypersonic weapons. The B-52 has tested several hypersonic prototypes in the past several years, and I can imagine a scenario where you have a workhorse like the B-52 using hypersonic weapons across long distances to attack targets in conjunction with the B-21.
In the past, there were actually a lot more countries operating strategic bombers, with the US, Russia, China, the UK, France, Germany, Italy, Israel, Kazakhstan, Ukraine, Libya, Indonesia, Iraq, and Egypt all having strategic bombers at one point in time. But today, the number of countries operating strategic bombers is just 3. The US, Russia, and China. And whilst China's military rise has been relatively recent, this was an area that Moscow had been focusing on since the 1950s, attempting to directly compete with the US. So how does Moscow's fleet look today? Does it still pose a threat to Washington or NATO? And how does Moscow use the fleet it has left? Well, to answer all of that, we turn to our second guest.
Part 2. Caught in the spider web.
By all accounts, the Tu-160 fleet is about 15. I very much doubt that's the number of airworthy airframes. I think realistically it's something like 10, if that. Even if we imagine that all of them, all 15, are theoretically airworthy, some will be undergoing modernization. So the number is very modest. Very modest.
Valery Yakamenko is a senior research associate at the Conflict Studies Research Center, with over 25 years' experience also working for the BBC Monitoring as an expert in the Russian military and security services. And as one of the most experienced analysts out there when it comes to understanding Moscow's defense and procurement, we're thrilled to have him on the program today.
The Tu-160 modernization program is twofold. Number one is to modernize the current fleet, and that entails the installation of a newer engine, the Mk3202, I think is the name, which is supposed to impart them with greater range, up to 1,000 kilometers more. Probably has been fitted to 1 or 2. The second element of the program is, as you mentioned, the construction, the manufacture of new airframes, the Tu-160M2. 3, at least, have been completed, maybe 4.
Okay, so before we get further into it, let's go through Russia's 3 strategic bombers. The first being the Tu-95MS, also known as the Bear. Now, this plane is a massive 4-engine turboprop plane whose original design actually goes right back to the 1950s, but today is used mostly as a missile carrier. Now, are these things slow? Yes. Are they old? You betcha. But they also have an absolutely huge payload capacity, and can travel a really significant distance, theoretically even being able to take off from Moscow and drop a nuclear weapon on Washington DC, as long as the pilot doesn't expect a return trip. Now obviously that one is from the first generation of strategic bombers we're talking about today, so the same as the B-52. But Russia's other two planes are both from the second generation, the first of these being the Tu-22M, also known as the Backfire, the Tu-22 being another supersonic swing-wing aircraft, whose original design entered service in the 1960s. The idea of the plane being a fast, theatre-range bomber, usually carrying something like a Kh-22 or a Kh-32. And from estimates, there's somewhere about 50 to 60 of these things still in service. Which then brings us to our third bomber, and the most modern of Russia's strategic bomber fleet. And by most modern, I mean it entered service in the 1980s. This one being the Tu-160, or Tu-160M, known as the Blackjack. Another supersonic swing-wing aircraft designed to launch standoff munitions or air-launched cruise missiles, and theoretically could use its speed to outrun a lot of the old Cold War air defense systems to drop nuclear bombs on targets in Europe. However, with where air defense is in 2025, I think the pilot even expecting a one-way journey with this one would be pretty generous, to say the least. Now, as old as these aircraft are, and as much as they were designed with the Cold War in mind, they are still all actively in service today. So can you take us through what sort of missions they're doing in conflict theaters like Ukraine?
So we have this curious overlap between the functionality, shall we say, almost mission creep between strategic nuclear deterrence and strategic non-nuclear deterrence, which is the role that had been used for in Ukraine. Now, it is another matter to what extent this campaign, the use of these bombers over Ukraine, has been successful, even proportionally, especially of late, over the past year, 2 years, maybe even 3 years. I think it's been well established that their use has been overshadowed by the use of the Shahed, the Iranian drone, as was the case, for example, a couple of nights ago. 9,600 of those things to Ukraine, as opposed to, if memory serves, 20 or so cruise missiles. So proportionally, it is a relatively insignificant proportion with regard to Russia's standoff fires. Added to that is the reputation of the Kh-101 and the argument as to exactly how effective it can be. Now, by that, I primarily mean the intercept rate of these air-launched cruise missiles, which is, by all accounts, quite substantial. So just how effective they are in the overall scheme of things, that is a question, shall we say.
Now, these strategic bombers came back into the headlines recently with Ukraine's Operation Spiderweb, this being the operation where Ukrainian forces reportedly managed to slip a whole bunch of drones deep into Russian territory and launch attacks against several Russian airbases. And according to some sources, managed to destroy as many as 7 first-generation Tu-95s and 4 second-generation Tu-22M3s. And whilst other estimates do put the final tally closer to 10 aircraft, either way it does mark a pretty significant blow to Russia's long-range aviation fleet. And for Moscow, this is also no small thing, as not only do we know how much Putin prioritizes the nuclear triad, but also outside the Tu-160, none of the other aircraft are currently in production within Russia, making any repairs or replenishment of these airframes very, very difficult. Now, whilst some military commentators are calling the losses a strategic setback and a reduction in Russia's capacity to launch longer-range strikes, others argue that bombers like the Bear or the Backfire are already somewhat antiquated over a battlefield like Ukraine, with Russia increasingly turning away from these craft in favour of cheaper, more survivable systems like drones. In fact, the last time these planes were used in a major mission against Ukraine was all the way back in December of 2023. Which brings us to our next question. What capacity does the strategic bomber fleet have left?
Some optimistic assessments say that up to 30% of Russia's nuclear bomber fleet has been disabled. I think we're talking about the disabling of about 10 Tu-95MS strategic bombers, which is the staple fleet, shall we say, out of a total of 50. So yes, considerable damage has been done, and the fleet has been decreased by Ukraine's very capable action. But nonetheless, if we accept the ballpark figure of 50 strategic nuclear bombers, some of which may not be airworthy, it is a sizable force. So yes, the fleet has been decreased slightly, mainly by Ukraine's attack on air, exhaustion of service life, and so forth. But it is, as I say, a mistake to write it off altogether.
So if Russia was to try and rebuild its strategic bomber force, that would probably require either starting up long dead production chains of some of its older aircraft, or building up replacement aircraft for the Tu-160s, an aircraft that's quite expensive to build, fairly expensive to operate, and currently only produced in very small numbers each year. So how urgently do you think Russia will look to replace the losses that occurred from these attacks?
We could approach this subject from several angles, one of which, as I alluded to previously, is the relative importance of Russia's strategic bomber fleet within the Russian nuclear triad, which is the least important of the three elements of it. So from that standpoint, it's not urgent to rebuild Russia's strategic bomber fleet. Now, it is of course another matter when we consider the mindset of people like Putin or Russia's military-industrial complex. Russia's military altogether, they seem to think that they have to keep up with the US at all costs. So that psychological element on the part of the Russian military, the mindset, how it perceives its superpower status, shall we say, about which it bangs on ad infinitum, all this chest punting. We're the world's primary nuclear superpower, even more so than the United States. So from that standpoint, I would imagine that there will be keenness to rebuild the fleet. Now, it's another matter to what extent they're capable of just such a rebuild. And it wouldn't appear to be very realistic. Even before Operation Spiderweb, there had been a campaign to modernize the Tu-95, to equip it with more launch capabilities, to extend its range perhaps, to extend its service life, but that had ground on exceedingly slowly. So now, in the conditions of warfare, with Russia clobbered by sanctions and its defense industry focused entirely on the war in Ukraine, is not a very realistic proposition. So much as they would like to rebuild it, it's not immediate or even short-term as a project. Possibly mid-term, but even then I would doubt it.
So with the bombers they have left in service then, the question becomes, are they actually capable of carrying out the task they were originally designed to do? That probably being the delivery of a nuclear weapon, either via the Pacific or via the Atlantic. Because whilst these aircraft still do carry long-range cruise missiles, all of them not only lack the stealth signature of something like a B-2, making them pretty loud and easy to track, but also unlike the US, Russia doesn't maintain a very wide, dispersed fleet of aerial refueling tankers. So in a world of layered missile defense systems and persistent satellite coverage, just how much of a strategic threat do these bombers pose to someone like the United States today?
I think the question to ask is, were it to come to the worst, let us say some kind of nuclear exchange between the United States or NATO and Russia, would Russia really have a need to resort to its nuclear bomber fleet either straight away or at a later stage altogether? As we have touched on, most of Russia's nuclear capabilities are associated with their land launch. Yes, a bomber flight, whether for deterrence or whether for actual use, is probably less drastic than the launch of an ICBM, which would trigger all manner of horrific consequences on both sides. But we're back to the question of to what extent they're functionally necessary in the first instance. From that standpoint, a bomber can be used to do a couple of flybys, armed, possibly, but as a weapon of choice for immediate use in the first instance in a situation like that, it is very doubtful that it will be regarded as such. But having said that, your question was spot on. It probably would not be especially useful for flight all the way to the United States. Yes, their range notionally allows a kind of one-way traffic, shall we say. But Russia does lack its refuel capability quite severely. It has, on paper, several tankers, the IL-70, the Ilyushin tanker. So, yeah, it can be used for action, shall we say, against the United States, but probably primarily with flights out of its northern bases, Europe would be much more practicable as a target for them. But then again, as soon as they were to approach within striking distance of Europe, there is the danger, of course, that they could come within range of European air defenses.
Now, whilst a lot of these criticisms are fair, if you were to ask Moscow, a lot of these are very soon to become completely irrelevant. Because Russia says its next generation strategic bomber is only just right around the corner. Enter the PAC-DA, or Perspective Aviation Complex for Long-Range Aviation. a third-generation stealth-capable bomber that is meant to replace both the Tu-95 and Tu-160 fleets. Now, design work on the PAK-DA reportedly began all the way back in 2009, with Tupolev promising to have a prototype in service by 2020. Now, according to Russian state media, this aircraft will not only be able to match the B-2 for stealth and distance, but will also be capable of launching swarms of drones mid-flight. And if you believe a similarly credible source at the UK's Daily Mail, they reported that one of their contacts within the Russian military told them that the PAK-DA would be able to fly into space before then returning to Earth to drop its payload. My hat absolutely goes off to whichever Russian intelligence officer gave them that one. Now, if we turn back to more realistic sources on the program, Tupolev hasn't met their deadlines here. We didn't see a prototype in 2020, and the reports that the plane was in construction in 2021 also haven't fielded very much evidence. As currently we've seen no footage, no photos, or no firm evidence that this aircraft is anywhere near close to rollout at the moment. So I want to ask you what would probably be a pretty basic question, but how real is the PAK-DA project? And how realistic are some of the claims that Russia's making here around its stealth capabilities?
I haven't heard anything about the PAK-DA for quite some time. So the status of the program is at best described as uncertain. I haven't heard anything at all about any kind of proximity to production or to a maiden flight or to anything like it, despite all the positive noises. But of course now, in the midst of the war with Ukraine, it's just, so far away realistically as to be irrelevant for the moment.
Okay, so let's say you don't buy the hype around the PAK-DA. The other counterpoint you might hear from the Russians is that, well, we don't need a stealth bomber, because we can shoot down stealth bombers. The idea being that Russia's latest air defense system, the S-400 and its even newer sibling, the S-500, are both capable of detecting and targeting stealth bombers like the B-2. As, according to Russian officials, these systems can track targets with low radar cross-sections, operate across multiple frequency bands, and even engage hypersonic threats. The only problem is that we also haven't seen them do that one either. So how realistic do you think those claims are, that the S-400s and S-500s can actually shoot down stealth bombers?
Yes, that's a very good question. We know that they shot down an F-117 early on during the Yugoslav crisis. Now, how they did that, whether it was pure luck or design, we don't really know. But the S-1 was shot down. With regard to their own stealth capabilities, well, none is in evidence. They do say the Felon, the Su-57, does sport some kind of reduced radar signature or stealth elements, but beggars belief, quite honestly. So when I look at the way these things are cobbled together, the Su-57 is just a joke. You have rivets, exposed rivet lines, and stuff like that.
Well, how high a priority is it to get this stealth right?
I'm sure work is underway. How realistic it is given the sanctions, their own industrial capabilities, their own design capabilities. It all is quite dicey, I think, for Russia to seriously claim that it's made major strides towards stealth of their own. All this thing has been overtaken by the war in Ukraine. They don't need stealth there.
Okay, so in the short to medium term, Ukraine is obviously going to crowd out a lot of the military spending, with the Russian Navy and the Russian Army and even the Russian Strategic Rocket Forces all desperately competing for cash within the budget. So how likely do you think it is that the Strategic Bomber Forces are likely to take a bit of a haircut within their budget? And if so, which programs do you think are likely to get cut?
It would seem that the PAK-DA is the primary candidate for being shelved, at least for now, because A, it's quite expensive, B, it's, as we have discussed, functionality or potential use is probably quite limited. Okay, let's say they develop the PAK-DA and, put it into service. The question, as we have already mentioned, would be, what would be its use? A deterrent? Yes, possibly, but further than that, actual use against the United States in conflict or Europe in conflict would be borderline irrelevant, shall we say, given all these other wonderful weapons they have. So, from purely a practical perspective, I'd say that the PAK-DA is up for the chop, at least temporarily, and the Su-57 is probably a priority, although to what extent it's a priority remains to be seen. Given what's going on in Ukraine, where they have no need for the Su-57 given the Su-34, the Su-32, the Su-30, quite successfully used as standoff launch platforms. Even the Su-57 is kind of a distant future, shall we say.
Well, in that case, what do you think the Russian strategic bomber force is going to look like in, let's say, 30 years' time?
My hunch is that it will continue to soldier on as is. I mean, the oldest platform is the Tu-95, which, as we know, dates back to the 1940s, 1950s. So I can just imagine what they're thinking. They're thinking, right, well, these yaks have the B-52, so, why shouldn't we have the Tu-95 and continue with it ad infinitum? So for now, it remains serviceable. The Tu-160 is a much newer platform, even if the Tu-95 were to suffer further cuts or, a decimation of the number for whatever reason, at least a handful remain. The Tu-160 will definitely remain. The Tu-22M3s fills in a niche between the Su-34 and the Tu-160. It will definitely stay. It's not that old. Maybe in lesser numbers. So my hunch is that it will continue to exist in these handfuls, but it will continue to exist.
So whilst Russia's bomber fleet seems unlikely to pose the kind of threat it once did, there is another that has some in Washington increasingly worried, that being China's. As whilst, as of the time of recording, China still does have a relatively old strategic bomber fleet, there seems to be far more credible rumours of a new platform China's about to push into service. One that would not only leapfrog Russia in strategic bombing capabilities, but also place targets like Taiwan, Japan and Guam in direct danger of the kinds of strikes that at present only really the US can do. So what is this new platform? How far along is it in the development cycle? And why has China chosen to not follow the US and Russia into the world of second generation strategic bombers? Well, to answer that, we turn to our final guest.
Part 3. The Catch-Up.
I think that the Chinese bomber fleet has become more important than it was simply because it has expanded alongside the Air Force, and it has grown to really a sort of long-range combat aircraft force, able to do electronic warfare, missile launch against land or sea targets, whereas some years ago, it was really just a collection of fairly old bombers, mostly armed with just freefall weapons, and pretty much behind the times.
Bill Sweetman is a veteran aerospace journalist and strategic consultant specializing in defense and aerospace systems. And with Bill having previously worked as the technical editor and aerospace and defense editor at Jane's, the editor-in-chief at Aviation Week Network, and a business area lead at Northrop Grumman, we are thrilled to have him on the program today.
I think the bomber or the missile carrier has some unique aspects. Yeah, you can use submarines, but by the time you've used all the missiles on the submarine, you've got to go back into port and refuel. If you're using long-range missiles, those missiles are quite big and quite expensive. You can only afford to stockpile so many of those. Moreover, particularly in the Chinese situation, land-based missiles cover different areas depending on where they're based and can't be easily moved across the entire theater. So if you've got standoff missiles aboard a bomber with sufficient range to stay out of the range of the wave defenses, you've got something that's mobile and can be based at any airfield around China and can fly possibly 1 to 2 fully armed missions per day. So it's a lot more flexible. Also, compared to a submarine, you've got perhaps a different mix of weapons on board depending what targets you're going after. And you're kind of stuck with that unless, again, you want to return to port to rearm. So the bomber has that degree of flexibility that's useful.
Okay, so before we get into the weeds on this one, let's lay out the basics of China's strategic bomber force, as on paper it's simultaneously both the simplest and also most confusing of all of them. You see, the H-6, China's main strategic bomber, originally was pretty much just a license-built Soviet Tu-16, a plane that first flew in 1959 and entered service with the Chinese military in 1969, putting it in that same lineage as those other first-generation aircraft like the B-52 or the Russian Tu-95. Where it gets complicated though is in the variants, as you'll see there's actually quite a lot of them. For instance, you'll see the H-6A, that one being an early nuclear bomb variant. Then you'll see the H-6G, that's effectively the naval maritime strike version of this thing. Then there's the H-6H and then the H-6M, both of which being cruise missile carriers, with one holding 2 and one holding 4. After that, then there's the H-6K, which is a re-engined long-range standoff bomber. And after that, then there's the H-6J, that being a modern naval striker optimized to usually carry anti-ship missiles. Then after that is the H-6N, which is an air-refuelable nuclear-capable standoff platform. And we're not done there, because we also have the H-6U and the H-6DU, these being the air refueler tankers for the Army and Navy respectively. So like an old mangled Chanel suit, Beijing really got its money's worth out of this blueprint. Now capability-wise, the bomber obviously does a lot more work than what it did back in the 1960s, carrying a huge amount of long-range land attack and anti-ship weapons into battle, as well as playing a key role within the support services and acting as one leg of China's nuclear triad. And in terms of sheer numbers, well, China kind of got its money's worth there as well, with China currently fielding the largest strategic bomber inventory of any of the countries we're talking about today, having somewhere around 220 to 230 of these planes currently in service. So Bill, obviously with where things stand today, with the Americans moving into the second and third generation and the Russians in the second generation, why has China chosen to remain so steadfast with this very old design?
For a lot of missions, what you need is a relatively long-range aircraft with a relatively large and flexible payload. And so essentially for that, you just need a truck, the way that the US Air Force uses the B-52. And by making some fairly simple adaptations to the original H-6, it's a platform that's good enough. Some of the versions have a lot of electronic equipment on board. Some are primarily designed to carry big stores on the center line. Others are equipped to carry multiple weapons under the wings. So yeah, it's just a very versatile platform that they could develop with relatively low risk.
Okay, so I get that back in the 1970s and 80s, China was nowhere near as rich as the United States or the Soviet Union. But with the Soviets having moved into the next generation of bombers, the supersonic swing wings back in the 1970s and 80s, and the Americans moving into the second generation in 1986 with the B-1, why haven't we seen China move into that same space in the period since?
The way the B-1 evolved, it was originally supposed to be able to attack targets directly by penetrating at low level with a very powerful jamming system. And it was adapted under Reagan to be much more of a basic weapon platform. Doesn't do its low-level mission anymore because it wouldn't survive. It's been taken off the nuclear mission. Essentially, it's doing the same sort of thing as a B-52, but it was compromised in its early days to do supersonic speed. For what they're doing with it, the H-6 is as good as a B-1 in many ways.
However, one of the main differences here between the H-6 and the B-52 is that the B-52's production line actually stopped working back in 1962, meaning that any time if a part breaks down on one of these aircraft, the US is forced to either cannibalize older aircraft or otherwise attempt to graft modern engines and avionics onto these very old legacy airframes. In contrast, China has kept the H-6 line pretty warm, producing these H-6 aircraft for pretty much the entire time. So Bill, if let's say the United States wanted to scale up its B-52 fleet, hoping to get up around somewhere near China's numbers, how much harder would it be to get a live production chain back up and running as compared to, let's say, how China's working at the moment?
They're going to find that putting the B-52 through another round of rebuild and modification is going to be much more expensive and more difficult than expected, versus China's approach of taking the old design, which they never really took out of production, and just keeping it in production.
So the other worry point for Washington is likely to be the other bomber that Beijing says is coming, this being the H-20. Now the H-20, rather than chasing any sort of supersonic or swing wing design, appears to be skipping straight to the third generation flying wing stealth design. Effectively, it's going to end up probably being something like a rough analog for the US B-2, taking up roles within the Chinese Air Force as both a conventional and nuclear strike vehicle. Now the DoD assesses that the H-20 is likely to have a range of somewhere between about 8,500 and 10,000 kilometers, meaning it was pretty explicitly built to use its stealth to be able to move in and strike targets like Guam without being detected, and then return back to the Chinese mainland without requiring a refueler. However, before you get too excited, I should also point out that a lot of this is also just rumors. And whilst China keeps putting out positive messaging and it seems to be much further along than other programs, as of the time of recording, there's still no public confirmation of a prototype being built or a first flight being done. So Bill, with that in mind, how long do you think it is before we start seeing the H-20 properly enter service with the Chinese Air Force?
I think we are probably getting close, just the way that the aircraft is talked about. We're getting close to seeing a prototype. Now, typically the way the Chinese work, it's about 8 years or so from the first prototype appearing through the sort of pre-production stage and into fully operational status. It may come along faster than that, I don't know. But I think we'll see prototypes fairly soon. Pre-production and production aircraft will follow somewhat behind that.
So from what little has actually leaked out so far about the H-20 program, it seems like the big hurdle Beijing's trying to get over at the moment is the engine itself. So with you having followed the Chinese Air Force for a very long time, how likely do you think it is that it's going to be the engines causing them the major problems?
The difficulty of the engine on an aircraft like the H-20 or the B-21 is it's not just the engine, it's making the engine run efficiently behind an inlet that also very effectively blocks radar waves. That, I think, is one of the technologies that has been critical to the B-21. Now, it's quite possible, and especially looking at the new J-36, it's quite possible that they will take a somewhat different approach and rely on a combination of stealth and active suppression of defenses. Rather than doing this very pure ultra-stealth design you see on the B-21, they might, for example, load the aircraft up with anti-radar missiles, or use complementary unmanned aircraft to kind of kick the door down or to degrade the defenses on the way in and the way out. So I think that the H-20 is likely to be a system of systems.
Okay, so looking forward now, in a theoretical Taiwan invasion scenario, with the Chinese launching a surprise attack against the Americans, what would these H-20s and H-6s likely be tasked with doing in that?
So if you're in a Taiwan scenario, I think that the H-6s today would be probably doing two things. One is contributing to the land attack against Taiwan's military, trying to take down its defenses as far as possible, perhaps trying to take down the power grid and otherwise start weakening the country. And I think the other thing they would be doing is carrying quite specific anti-aircraft carrier weapons over the entire region. Again, they might not be the first line of attack against an aircraft carrier, but they would certainly be contributing firepower to the second wave. I mean, assuming, for example, that the Chinese were able to not sink a supercarrier, but damage it sufficiently to stop it doing air operations for an extended period of time, 12 hours or so. In that case, the role of the H-6 would be to launch a lot of weapons against the carrier and the rest of the strike group.
So when talking about the Chinese military, I do still hear a lot of people talk about China as a very quantity over quality force. When it comes to their strategic bombers, it does look somewhat right. After all, China has the biggest strategic bomber fleet of the three nations, but the entire fleet are made up of mostly Gen 1 planes. Now, obviously moving straight to something like the H-20 would then counter that narrative. So do you think China is starting to move its air force towards a quality over quantity model?
The Chinese air forces have moved in the direction of quality. It's interesting to look at the PLA Air Force Museum outside Beijing and the vast collections of old aircraft they have. Most museums have one of everything. They've got dozens of older type aircraft. And there have been massive retirements of those aircraft and a focus on still quite substantial numbers of new aircraft. You know, as we've seen since Christmas, there's a new wave of aircraft coming along, but those aircraft are in their prototype stages, so they're not going to be in service in numbers for a few years yet. On top of that, they've done a tremendous amount of investment in airborne radars and in airborne standoff jamming systems that really hasn't been matched anywhere in the West. The US, in fact, has sadly neglected its AWACS fleet and suddenly ran into the recognition that it needed to be replaced then found that that was going to be very expensive, and they're making this sort of rather drastic move into, well, can we do all this from space? And the Chinese seem to have taken the view that in their regional area, they want to do it from airborne platforms. They have a variety of those, including their airborne battle management, their airborne even weapon guidance support. And that's because all their modern types have active electronically scanned array, and that's much more useful for things like battle management and weapon support than a rotating antenna like AWACS. The Chinese have really worked very, very hard on all this on the airborne platforms, including a very large variety of airborne electronic warfare type aircraft.
So in that case, where do you see the Chinese strategic bomber fleet going over the next 30 years?
I think we're going to see a very, very capable force emerge. And I would sort of contrast that a bit with the US forces, where you've always seen a lot of competition going on between different communities, between the Air Force, the Navy, the Marine Corps, and even within the Air Force, particularly fighters versus bombers. So depending on who's in charge and who's dominant, it just gets difficult to expand the non-mainstream systems. So if you look at the very big picture of US Air Force planning, I would say that the bomber force for a long time was badly neglected. It took a tremendous amount of time and effort to get the B-21 program started. I knew a lot of the people involved, and there was just a lot of opposition from other service interests, and even to some extent from the fighter branch, to be spending that kind of money on a strategic bomber. And while competition is good in some ways, it fosters alternative approaches. In a lot of cases in the States, it's led to delay and awkward compromises. I mean, particularly if you look at the influence of the Marines over the F-35 design, their requirements defined the F-35 to a great extent and led to a lot of the complications in development. So I think, going back to China, you're seeing a very integrated force evolve. And what you'll see at the parade is that the fighter elements are going to be led mostly by support elements. So at the front of each fighter element in the flyby, you'll see a tanker or an electronic warfare aircraft or an airborne radar. And I think that's kind of symbolic to say, these guys aren't just the ones driving the trucks around. They are vital to air power.
So when all said and done, how important are strategic bomber fleets to each of the major players? Well, for the United States, very. You see, if you're a country who wants the ability to carry out survivable, global strikes at a moment's notice anywhere in the world, platforms like the B-2 and pretty soon the B-21 are pretty much invaluable, as not only can they deliver precision-guided bombs and cruise missiles, but they're also among some of the only airframes in the US Air Force currently capable of deploying things like the GBU-57 bunker buster, weapons that something like an F-35 or an F-15 just simply can't carry. These strategic bombers also offer a range that is simply just unmatched. And to put it in perspective, whilst the US are able to use their B-2s to carry out strikes anywhere from Europe to Africa to the Middle East, if you were to launch an F-35 from Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri, where most of the B-2s are based, rather than making it all the way to the other side of the world with only a couple of refuels, that F-35 would only make it to West Virginia before having to turn around and come back. That kind of long-range flexibility, paired with deep strike stealth, makes these platforms a pretty central pillar in America's air power doctrine. But what about the other nations? Well, for China, the picture around strategic bombers is arguably still evolving, with the H-6 and all its current variants serving more regional roles at the moment, where rather than be on a strike anywhere in the world, they primarily operate within just the first and second island chains. But then again, if the rumors around the H-20 are true, and it really does have these stealth capabilities that are on par with a B-2, well, that does change some of the calculus here within the Western Pacific, creating a situation where Beijing's opening salvo in a future conflict against the United States begins to look very different. As rather than satellite systems like SIBRs catching mass missile launchers from inland China, or US radars spotting takeoffs from Chinese carrier decks, if the H-20 matches the hype, well, that would allow China to insert stealth platforms right into the Western Pacific and carry out deep strikes on enemy positions with virtually no warning, significantly raising the stakes on the opening gambits. But that's only two of our players. What about our third? Russia. Well, from what it seems, Russia might be a slightly different story, as whilst I'm sure Moscow would probably like to field something similar to the USB-2, from what we understand the PAC-DA project was turning out to be a bit of a distant dream in 2021 and a pretty impossible one post-2022, with much louder voices from within the Russian armed forces all currently crying out for funding and replenishment. As a result, for now, Moscow is probably left with an aging fleet of Cold War bombers, one that is, yes, capable of long-range standoff strikes, also very costly to maintain, vulnerable to modern air defense systems, and in many situations, useful for little more than a one-way flight. Will that change, and will the Kremlin ever be able to push past this into the PAC-DA, finally bringing a prototype for the weapon system into service? Well, at this point, that's anyone's guess. But if they do so, would change their calculus, and allow Moscow to operate much more freely over enemy airspace, and drop much heavier munitions on key targets. But if we look at the bigger picture, will strategic bombers become more important in the future? Well, I would argue yes, both as precision strike weapons, a key to the new language of war, and as a way of forcing your opponent to divert defense materials away to prepare for a strike that could come from any direction, at any time. And for that reason, it's something that should be very much watched for, even if it's hard to detect. Thank you so much for checking out the show this week, and what a chaos it has been. We originally actually had an entirely different episode ready for this slot. Researched, mostly taped, partly edited, and even had the artwork done. And then just a week out from launch, the White House decided to make an announcement that pretty much upended massive chunks of the episode. So rather than give you guys an already stale episode, we decided to push this episode up in the order, and are currently re-editing and recording additional vocals for the previous episode. So at this point we're late, exhausted, but just glad the White House didn't announce any massive changes to their strategic bomber fleet. However, that episode we were working on should be out this month as well. And if you want to keep up with when that is coming out, you can find all of the links and info about it on our Twitter, Reddit, Blue Sky, Mastodon, Threads, Instagram, Facebook, Discord, and TikTok on the handle @TheRedLinePod. Or if you're keen to follow me, I'm on the Twitter handle @MikeElliottOz. Oz is in Australia. This show is only possible with the support of our amazing Patreons, who donate a small amount of money each month to help myself and the team keep this show going. And speaking of amazing Patreons, this month I'd like to thank Nathaniel, Mikhail, David Coven, Kyle Horrister, PM25, Vicky Tran, Daniel Mayton, and Stefan Jansen. This show is only possible because of the support from listeners like these guys. So if you feel you can spare a couple of dollars, and you want special access to our video presentations, like our recent video going through a 2025 invasion of Taiwan by China, or a 2024 invasion of Georgia by Russia, you can do so by joining our Patreon today using the links in the description, and we'd really appreciate it. But for now, this episode about strategic bombers is all thanks to you guys. As usual, here are our 3 book recommendations. The first being Designing a Strategic Bomber by David J. Gordon, for a look at how countries design their strategic bomber programs and how their role is changing in modern warfare. The second being Soviet Strategic Bombers, The Hammer and the Sickle by Jason Nicholas Moore, for a closer look at the Russian and Soviet strategic bomber programs. And the third is Modernizing China's Air Force by Patricia M. Fornes. This one looking at the developments currently taking place within the Chinese Air Force. I want to thank this week's guests, David Gordon, Valery Yakomenko, and Bill Sweetman. All of you were absolutely fantastic for this episode, as well as a special thanks to the US Air Force for clearing this one and working on a pretty tight deadline. In addition to those guys, I'd also like to thank the primary researchers of this piece. That'd be Ben Spencer, Perry Grace, and Raul Devanarayanan. Obviously, with the timeline shifted, everything became a bit of a crunch. On top of those guys, I want to thank the rest of my team. They've been Cameron Gale, the producer, Jack Schenkman, the production manager, Daniela Juvella, Nate Ostilla, Robbie Sutton, Nick McNally, Jemima Pentreath, Ben Nutter, Genevieve Donald May, Perry Grace, Gabriel Lane, Lorenz von Kiebilk, Ben Spencer, Andrew Gundle, Scott Missler Ferguson, and Sean Cotter-Lem, my research assistants and writers. Jamie Tannower, media director, Raul Devanarayanan, OSINT analyst, Mark Spencer, our second voiceover artist, Kashyap Maheshwari, Ethan Lee, and Alexander Vulgarten from our online team, Jonah Gunn, our production assistant, Alexi Heimakainen, our Discord moderator, Joe Hawthorne, our audio cleaner, and Nick Much, our field correspondent. It takes a great team to put an episode together in a month. It takes an amazing team to be able to do one in effectively a week and a half. And lastly, the Red Line will be back this month with another international episode. But until then, thank you for listening, and good night.
The views and opinions expressed in this episode are solely those of Michael, our guests, and the Red Line podcast. They do not represent any government or organization and are solely our own. For more information, please visit theredlinepodcast.com.